Our This is the next workshop in the 2024 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Leveraging Social Justice Approaches to Affirm and Support World Language Students by Dr. Pamela M. Wesely. What do we know about how to teach for social justice in the world language classes? How can we create more equitable and affirming world language classrooms for all of our students? In this webinar, the presenter and co-author of Words and Actions, Teaching Language Through the Lens of Social Justice, ACTFL 2014 and 2018, will pair recent scholarships on gender just and racially just language pedagogies with frameworks in social justice education. Participants will come away with new ideas about how to connect these ideas in the classroom with NYSED guidance, including the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages, Checkpoint Proficiency Targets, and New York State Themes and Topics. Our workshop presenter today is Dr. Pamela M. Wesely. Dr. Wesely received her PhD in Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Minnesota in 2009, and she is currently a professor of multilingual education and the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs in the College of Education at the University of Iowa. Dr. Wesely's scholarship and teaching examines K-12 world language education in the United States. Building on 8 years of work as a middle school French teacher and 11 years working in the experiential learning environment of Concordia Language Villages in Minnesota, she studies the attitudes, motivations, perceptions, and beliefs of stakeholders in K-12 world language education. She is particularly interested in pedagogical innovation that departs from the grammar-based curriculum, like content-based instruction, instruction focused on comprehensible input, social justice education, and technology integration in the language classroom. Her work has been published in journals including Foreign Language Annals, Modern Language Journal, Journal of Teacher Education, Calico Journal, Language Teaching Research, and Journal of Mixed Methods Research. She is the co-author of Words and Actions, Teaching Languages Through the Lens of Social Justice, which, by the way, happens to be our 2024-2025 book study. She is a former treasurer and member of the board of directors of the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, otherwise known as ACTFL, as well as a former president of the Iowa World Language Association. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Wesely to begin this workshop.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm very excited to be here virtually. I'm coming to you from Iowa City, Iowa. I did mention that I will have a child attending school in New York University in the fall, so I will be in your state a little bit more in the near future. But I'm very excited to talk with you a little bit about some of these concepts that I think are just so vitally important. To get started, we have these keys. I'll be using them. I think that generally speaking, as already mentioned, please keep your microphone muted during this presentation. We are not going to have any discussion with this many people. It will not be possible, but I will be using some of the other symbols that if there's a little blue, cloud, then that means time for you to think and reflect. I will have a couple moments when I'll be asking you to write in the chat box. It'll usually just be one or two words or phrases. And then I'll also be directing you to the Google folder. I've numbered the handouts, so I'll just have the little number on the folder to help you out. So the goals for today's session, there's a lot of goals and it's 45 minutes, so we'll see how it goes, but identify and define key components of social justice education, relating it to the New York State Guidelines for Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education and the Learning Standards for Language Education. Third, we'll be relating current research on gender just and racially just pedagogy with social justice education, then also with language education. And then we'll end with sort of a chance for you to reflect on your own curriculum, identifying points of entry in your curriculum, or if you are someone who's oversees a program or works with teachers, to think through what are areas where social justice education and related topics can be integrated into the language classroom. So those are our goals. So we're going to start with talking about defining social justice education and relating it to the New York frameworks. So social justice is a philosophy, an approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. And I think the three words that I have underlined here, philosophy, so it's sort of how we think, an approach is sort of how we plan, but then also actions. So it's not just a matter of thinking and planning, but also doing. That's really central to a lot of aspects of social justice. It's not just about thinking, it's not just about awareness raising, but also about doing. Um, so, social justice education. So, that was social justice. This is social justice education, where we're talking about challenging, confronting, and disrupting misconceptions, untruths, and stereotypes that lead to structural inequality and discrimination, provides all students with resources necessary to learn to their full potential, and it draws on the talents and strengths that students bring to their education and creates a learning environment that promotes critical thinking and agency for social change. So, again, we're thinking about doing, we're thinking about thinking and planning. And in the classroom, we're thinking about, working with students and drawing from students and building and sustaining students, which fits very well with some of the things that you have been putting together as frameworks in New York. Um, I'm going to talk about the social justice standards. These were published by Learning for Justice, formerly um, Teaching Tolerance, the website. It's available on the website. They're also uploaded to the handouts. I think just a summary of them is uploaded to the handouts. But if you Google social justice standards, you'll find them. And in the social justice standards, these were published in 2017. Um, you'll find there are four sort of domains. And so they're focused primarily on K-12, but I know many of you might be post-secondary educators. But these domains uh, are what this organization has identified as sort of central to teaching for social justice. So, to give you some brief definitions, identity is the idea of creating a positive social identity, belonging in multiple groups and negotiating multiple spaces, taking pride in identity without denying the value of others. And as I'm talking, I want to encourage you also to reflect on the world language classroom and what we do in the world language classroom that might address some of these standards. In diversity, that's about identifying similarities and differences, empathy, creating empathy and connection with students, and looking at diversity in context and in history. Okay, so these, as with many standards, these are scaled to different ages, right? So when you're talking about really young children, you might be talking about just identifying similarities and differences. When you get into older, more advanced students, you might talk about things like looking at diversity in context and in history. Um, Justice this domain is about recognizing stereotypes. That's a word we've already heard a couple times here. Recognizing unfairness, the harmful impact of bias and injustice, looking at power in relationships now and historically. And then finally, action. So notice this word action here again. Expressing empathy, recognizing responsibility, and making decisions about when to stand up and carry out collective action against bias and injustice. So these are what this organization identifies as the four main domains of social justice education. Now, when we're talking about the standards, we also can talk about and so I've just selected in this next slide, selected some standards that I think connect particularly well to social justice education. So identity number 5, so that's their fifth standard, that students will recognize the traits of the dominant culture, their home culture and other cultures, and understand how they negotiate their own identity in multiple spaces. So I think that definitely connects to when we think about world language education. Diversity, number 7, is students will develop language and knowledge to accurately and respectfully describe how people, including themselves, are both similar to and different from each other and others in their identity groups. So describing is something that we do a lot in the language classroom at different levels. I was a middle school French teacher, as was said in my introduction, so I often am thinking about how do we do this work in the at the elementary, at the lower levels, at the more novice levels. I see someone is writing on the slides. I would invite you not to do that because we all can see what you're writing. So maybe don't do that notes and maybe take that notes in a different way. Somebody had underlined identity. I'm just worried right now that's not a problem at all, but I'm worried if that continues, that might disrupt a bit. Um, Justice, number 11, students will recognize stereotypes and relate to people as individuals rather than representatives of groups. So again, we see this word stereotypes. Um, and then action, number 17, students will recognize their own responsibility to stand up to exclusion, prejudice, and injustice. So you can see here that these are some different things that might connect a little bit to some of the world language standards that we have, and that also might connect to um, the New York standards and the New York guidelines that you are working with in the state. So, and I will just say, I know that there's some stuff going on in the chat. I'm not looking at the chat. I know that Bill's managing the chat. So if you're asking me questions, we may get a chance to look at them later, but I'm not going to be looking at the chat right now. So going to the culturally responsive sustaining education framework. So again, keeping in mind what we just talked about with the social justice standards, and then there's a lot of different sort of in the document. There's a lot of different ways of considering culturally responsive and sustaining education. But I found sort of this resonating with this particular part of the document of what we're looking for students to create, what we're looking for in students who experience academic success. So you can see here, um, looking at students who are prepared for rigor and independent learning. I see the term critical reasoning in here, looking at a growth mindset. I think those are things that maybe we've seen in some of the social justice standards. I think particularly in number 2, looking at students acknowledging the limitations of their own perspective. Empathy is a word we've heard a couple times now already. Um, Cooperation and teamwork, using active listening and communication skills to resolve conflict, building relationships, and valuing, in the second paragraph, valuing students' cultural identities, looking at role models, looking at the community. Those are all things that we sort of are seeing as related to social justice education. And then the third component here, students have a critical lens. They're bringing a critical lens to history and contemporary conditions of inequity, learning from historically marginalized voices. So the idea of learning from everyone, not just the voices that have historically dominated. Um, we're seeing the word power and privilege here. Okay. So think about the ways that this connects to these and to this, right? Thinking about how those, what connections are we seeing with social justice and then also with culturally responsive and sustaining framework. Now I'm going to turn to the standards for learning world languages in New York. So here's sort of the central ones, the anchor standards that we're seeing here. So if we look here, these are clearly modeled on the ACTFL World Readiness Standards, and talking about different types of communication, looking at communicating effectively, understanding, interpreting, and analyzing what is heard, received, or viewed on a variety of topics, a range of texts, including authentic resources. To look at standard 2, oops, sorry about that, to look at spontaneous spoken, visual, or written communication to exchange information, express feelings, looking at presenting information and ideas to a variety of audiences to describe, inform, narrate, explain, or persuade. And then the standards, again, we're talking about, the culture standard, we're looking at practices, products, and perspectives. So looking at what are these practices, products, and perspective, and how do they relate to one another? And then how do they compare with the cultures studied and their own? So we're seeing, again, some of these themes of cultural, looking at similarities and differences and things like that. So my question to you is, what are some things that you saw in common across all 3 frameworks? And if you could identify, I've already pulled out some words for you, so we can put those back in the chat. And you have the reference, I'm sorry, that you can see in the corner here, the little folder. So that's handout number 2 was these culturally responsive sustaining education framework. Number 3 was the standards. So if you'd like to look at those and take a few moments and let's identify what are some things that you saw in common across the 3 frameworks, and write in some words in the chat that you saw. Try to limit yourself to single words or short phrases, just because that's a lot to read among all of the participants. So please go ahead and do that right now. So we're talking about similarities. Mhm. Mhm. Good. Yeah, empathy, identities, culture, action, cultural competence, language, empathy, perspective, action, identity. Yeah, I think looking at strengths, describing. Good. So we definitely saw some connections across all three of these frameworks. The way we think about teaching world languages does connect to social justice education, as well as the New York standards for culturally sustaining and responsive pedagogy. There are connections there. There are also differences. So now I'm going to invite you to put some differences in the chat. What were some things that were different? I would actually encourage you to compare the first two frameworks with the world language guidance. What are some things that maybe you didn't see in one or the other what was emphasized in one that you didn't see in another? What are some areas of disconnect or difference? This might be harder to put in one word, but you can, in short phrases, I'd recommend. Yeah, nothing language specific, stress on communication. And nothing language specific in the social justice standards. Yeah, comprehensibility is not something that we saw in all of them. Or stress on communication was not something we necessarily saw in all of them. Good. Yeah, social skills. Yeah, taking actions, I think was some of you put actions as a similarity, and I definitely saw that across the first two, but I'm not sure if we talk as much about taking action in the world language standards. And I'll be clear, this is not because this is not a critique of those standards. I think we have to be frank about what we look for in world language education, um, and be honest about it. I mean, yeah, empathy. I mean, a lot of people said empathy was there, but I'm not sure as much if we saw that as much in the third in the world language standards. Communication, social interactions, that was maybe as more absent from the first few. Comfort, not in the world language. Okay. So the point that I want to come to with this is that these three different frameworks, you know, they're not the same. They're not the same thing. There are differences among them that are important for us to consider. I want to encourage world language teachers across the US to not say, well, I teach world language, so I automatically teach for social justice because I teach about language and culture. Um, because for me, um, and for my co authors and other people who study social justice education in world language education, that sort of disregards the fact that you actually have to plan to teach for social justice. You can't just let it happen. It doesn't happen in an ad hoc way. And the research supports this. There's a great deal of research on even just having texts. And a lot of this research is based in elementary education and elementary literacy education. Just having texts with multiple representations in the classroom there, but the teacher never talks about it. The teacher never asks students to reflect on the different perspectives that are shown in those texts actually does not have an effect on the students. Students don't automatically pick up on ideas relating to justice or identity or diversity. Those need to be built in. Those need to be explicitly made as goals of the classroom to have an effect, to have an outcome, a learning outcome for students. Um, so I recognize that in world language education, in language education, we do focus on communication. We want our students to be able to communicate in the language. That is central to much of what we do. Um, and it is understandable that sometimes that is going to take, and most of the time that might take precedence over teaching for social justice or teaching for, teaching culturally responsive or sustaining education. Um, but don't be fooled that you're automatically doing those things just because you're teaching a language and teaching about culture. One thing that we recognize a lot with our book and with sort of the work that we do is that sometimes teachers think that a really good cultural lesson is automatically a social justice lesson, and that's not necessarily true. I would say if you have students do projects where they investigate the biography of um, activists, I'm not sure if that's teaching for social justice. There may be meeting some of there may be meeting some of those domains, but if you're not really having them think through action, if you're not really having them reflect on their own identities and their own and how power plays a role, it's just a really good cultural lesson. And so that's sort of one of my points with this section. I'm joined in this by my colleagues in the field who study racially just and gender just pedagogies as they relate specifically to language education. And so that's our second, or so our third goal in this workshop is to talk a little in this webinar is to talk a little bit about how those relate to world language education. And I'm going to call upon my expert colleagues, Uju Anya, who has done some really wonderful work in critical race pedagogy for more effective and inclusive world language teaching. I recommend that you look at that. This is actually a open source article, so you don't need to have. She made it available to anyone. And she did a plenary at the American Association of Applied Linguistics in 2022. And she, in this work, she looked at post hoc critical race theory and analyzed findings from two studies where she really looked at sort of the liberal myth of race neutrality. And she presented counter narratives by Black instructors and students. And she rejected the dominant ideas of world language programs being a place of equitable and harmonious multiculturalism. That we sort of see world language classrooms as a place where everybody is, there's automatic equity and automatic multiculturalism in the world language classroom. And she suggests a more critical perspective on world language teaching and on the world language classroom, that we don't just automatically assume that because we are in a classroom where language and culture is taught, that that we are automatically equitable and automatically multicultural. That is a more complex that is more complex than simply just having language and culture in the classroom. Chris Knisley and Joshua Pace, who study who study trans and queer pedagogies. They in this article they brought a really interesting perspective on the push. They want to resist heteronormativity in queer applied linguistics. So the idea here, heteronormativity is, when you present every couple, you might not, as a teacher, and this is definitely true of myself when I was a teacher, I would, use my materials and show students the materials that were there. And I wouldn't say there are no queer couples in France. I wouldn't say that in my classroom. Of course, I wouldn't say that. That would be a terrible thing to say. But I also would not show them examples of queer couples in France or non-binary individuals. They were not present. And so that's the idea of sort of heteronormativity, that because the only examples that you show to your students they're all the same, that means that makes it a normal, and that makes it normative. And so the idea here is, how can you resist that as a teacher? And so they looked at trans, non-binary, and queer understandings, and the sort of disciplinary invisibility around trans individuals. And also they looked at the idea of transpositionalities read within the binary, that someone has to be a trans man or a trans woman, which still is readable to the cisgender majority, that people who are non-binary, people who don't fall within the binary, literally, encourage us to deconstruct those paradigms. The idea of sort of allowing for gender fluidity in the world language classroom and creating a space for students to become aware of and engage with normative discourses. So some of you might be thinking, I don't know how I would start to do this in my classroom. How would I do this? And one way is, again, to sort of create that space for students, to create that place where students can where you can talk to the students about the fact that everybody on this page, all these couples on this page are heterosexual couples. Does anyone else recognize that? Do we all recognize that there's one man, one woman in these couples, or in the representative of the relationships here? And so drawing students' attention to that normativity that exists. And they offer, in their article, offer queer inquiry-based pedagogies as a solution. So the idea of asking students, why do you think that is? Why do you think this is presented as a normal family? Why do you think that this book says normal? This goes back to some of those, if you're familiar with comprehensible input, those comprehensible input readers where they say, so-and-so is in a normal family. Well, what does that mean when you say this is a normal family? It means that some families are not normal. And so trying to question that and have your students engage with that. Um, and then this piece is a classic piece. It's from 2019, but it's already classic. Um, these are two dominant scholars on ratio-linguistic ideology. Any of their work is excellent. They challenge the idea of additive bilingualism. They say that, that it fails to account for the ratio-linguistic ideologies that connect racialized communities with deficient models of personhood. So the idea that, that students need English, students in English language education, they've got really bad English, the idea of sort of looking at deficits rather than looking at assets. So they propose a shift from focusing second language acquisition research on language practices of the racialized speaking subject toward the uptake of the white listening subject. So less focusing on what do these people not have, but rather focusing on what do the people who are listening not have, right? Why is the white listening subject not engaging correctly? And so it's sort of challenging this idea of the sympathetic interlocutor, right? So we always sort of assume that when we talk to our students about going to another country and speaking to people, that they will have somebody sympathetic talking with them. And, we really hope that's the case, but we have to also recognize that isn't going to be the case all the time. So looking also at who's listening, who's listening, and then who's listening to our students of color, who's listening to our students who may not meet the sort of normative expectation of what a language speaker is. And focusing research on that than on the deficiencies of the students, of the speakers. And, they're talking about dismantling white supremacy, over incorporating racialized populations into mainstream institutions. So some really great work that's being done, some research that's being done in anti-racism and incorporating trans pedagogies into language education. And so I hope that some of these different pieces have made you think a little bit about what are the sort of questions that we have in the field about these different topics. And then you also, again, might be thinking, okay, great, that's great, but what does that mean for my classroom practice or for the classroom practice of the teachers that I work with? So hopefully we've thought a little bit about that, and then ask ourselves the question, if, when you have classroom materials, thinking about who is represented and centered in your materials, who is absent from your materials, who is not pictured in your texts. Thinking about what cultures are depicted in your materials, who creates your materials, and then who is the intended or assumed audience for your materials. All of those things are very important to consider, and those are projects that you can think through with your students, depending on your students' level and their sort of abstract thinking capabilities. Can you have your students look at the pictures that you have in your materials, that you have on your slides, that you have in your books? Whether or not you use a textbook, you still use some kind of materials. The websites that you look at, have them do a little, examination of sort of the normative expectations of who are the people that you are who are the members of the culture that you're studying, and then who's created the materials, who gets to determine that, right? Who gets to say who's in your materials? Um, so those are some things to consider and for you to reflect on too as teachers. Um, so then entry points, right? What what are the things that we can think about as places to start? Um, so going back to these standards, and I'm particularly focusing on the culture standard, the concepts of practices, products, practices, and perspectives. I'm assuming you're all very familiar with them. When I teach them to my pre-service teachers, I talk about products as the things that people have, practices as the things that people do, and perspectives as the things that people think or they are, right? So like words to describe people. Um, and that's a very simplistic way to think about it, but it generally works. And so how do we take these and we move away from a product is this, is la baguette, right? Is a piece of French bread, like that's a product. There are many things that you can think about when you think about French bread. You can think about many things in terms of the ways that bakeries work within the culture, the ways that who gets to go to bakeries and how, is it where do those products come from? Where do those skill sets come from and things like that? Um, and also who does not eat baguettes in France? You can think about a lot of those different things. Um, and so I would encourage you to think through products, practices, and perspectives in light of a social justice framework. So when I do that, first, when we think about products, you can think about social justice issues that focus on access to and relationships with tangible and intangible resources. So some examples of looking at products might be thinking about access to something like clean water. How does access to clean water affect developing countries and communities? You might think about the ways that immigration laws shape decisions made by individuals. So product, a cultural product could be a law, right? You could look at educational systems and language policy. Those could be products, okay? So those are things to think about when you're thinking about products in a social justice lens. Practices, social justice issues that arise from how people interact. Excuse me. So examples might include activist movements and how they achieve their goals, language usage and its implications in specific contexts, right? What languages are used, what varieties of language are used, things like that. Ways that communities express themselves in the face of oppression. Those are all, social justice issues that arise from how people interact. And then finally, social justice issues that stem from attitudes and values would be the perspectives. Examples could be how beliefs about the humanity of an individual groups affect their access to employment, the evolution of beliefs about homosexuality and marriage laws in target cultures, the ways that politicians and political writers express belief through speeches. So those are all some perspectives that you might have, again, looking at a social justice lens. I know this is a brief workshop, so we don't have a lot more examples, but I want to encourage you to look at the themes and topics document that has been generated by your state that's in the shared folder. It's handout number 5. And I want you to take some time. So there's the little thinking bubble. Think about which topics do you feel would best integrate with social justice education approaches, and then how would you do that? So all that we've been talking about, all the different sort of structures and frameworks for social justice education that we've been discussing, where do you feel like you could integrate some topics like that into the topics that are listed in that themes and topics document? You can do that, so you could do both of these, or you could just do one of them, thinking about your own current curriculum. Where do you see entry points for integrating with social justice education? And so I encourage you, to think about things not just of like, I'm going to create a new unit, but also thinking about some of um, the the um, the pedagogies that we were talking about, right? So trans pedagogies or racially just pedagogies. Where can you see entry points for bringing in more voices, bringing in more representations, engaging your students more with some social justice concepts in your own curriculum. So I encourage you to go to that handout, number 5, and take a little time to think through some entry points, and then we'll have a little time to share. So maybe I'll give about 5 minutes for you to look at those entry point to look at that document, and then maybe we'll come back and we can do some time to share in the chat. I'm going to take a look at the chat right now. I see that some things are happening in there. So and I encourage you to start putting your entries into the chat right now. Um, I think some of you may already be doing that. So put about 5 minutes on my watch to give you a little time to process some of these different things. About 2 more minutes, and I want to encourage you to put uh, I know it said sort of a short word, but maybe put a couple words of explanation of how you'll take it into social justice area. You know, like what would that idea be? And again, think about those 4 domains of identity, justice, diversity, and action. Where do you see action in your own curriculum? Where do you see the potential to do action? All right, that's 5 minutes, so I'm going to start talking again, but feel free to continue to put things in the chat if you have some things you haven't had a chance to enter yet. Um, but I appreciate everybody's ideas. I think there's a lot of ideas in here that I saw there's a fast fashion. I know that we've done some sample units with, talking about fashion and talking about what people, oops, sorry about that, what people wear. But then also, not just the shopping unit, but also what does it mean to shop in different places? What are the impacts on the environment to shopping for new clothes versus, vintage or secondhand clothes? I think a lot of comments here about sort of housing, redlining, right? So who gets to live where and what decisions go into that? So again, that can go along with the topic on the house. Like I said, my background is teaching very novice level students, and so we always have that house unit, right? That we talk about, what's in the house. So talking about, what are neighborhoods? How do we determine what neighborhoods are, and things like that. Um, I like the showing male or transgender students being able to celebrate a quinceañera. I think, I think that's a really great idea. I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great ideas here. And doing a unit on zero garbage, reducing waste footprint. I think, let's see, what are some other ones I like the idea. Several of you have mentioned leisure, and I like the idea of looking at leisure because I think we often think of that sort of, what do you like to do? I like to ski, I like to play tennis, and just thinking about, having students call into question a little bit more what things are listed as acceptable activities and who has time and resources to do those things. I think we talk a lot about, in the book, I know we talk about the list of occupations. When you have in a sort of a very traditional textbook, which you may not all use, but when you have that traditional textbook, usually there's a unit on occupations. What occupations are included in that, and which ones are not? And what does that mean? Um, and why do we put so much emphasis on shopping? Well, because it's a really easy way to get students to use simple vocabulary in a way where they're exchanging information. But what is, thinking about when we bring that into the classroom, are there other ways that we can approach things like, clothing vocabulary or even store vocabulary where we can bring a little bit more of a critical lens to that, more of a comparison, um, a cultural comparison aspect of that. A few things that often come up, and I will say that, there's a lot of examples out there. I think we have, things like standards of beauty when you're talking about describing people, what makes somebody beautiful. That's another thing that we hear about a lot. When you're talking about work, talking about child labor, right? Who determines when it's okay to work and when it's okay not to work? And what do those rules mean? And how does that relate to justice? How does that relate to advocacy? How does that relate to activism? Um, yeah, and so yeah, how does this relates to some of the ideas here. How is access to and experience with pastimes and sports influenced by socioeconomic status, ability, culture, and technology? Um, so, I mean, a lot of these things can build off of students' lived experiences, the lived experiences in their community. Who gets to be in the school play? Who gets to be, who gets to do a sport after school and not have to work? Having students reflect on their own communities can also be helpful. Um, and uh, we definitely have, one thing that we always like to sort of talk about a little bit, is the idea of not uh, having units where you are depicting the target cultures as needing help, right? So when we talk about action, sometimes people, and I haven't seen this in the comments here, but it's fine. Some people do sort of um, donate, food drives or donation drives, and as part of what they do in the classroom. We're going to gather resources and share them with the community. And I do think it's important when you're teaching for social justice not to talk about, we are going to benefit the target community. We are going to go in and help the target community, whether that be a local community, whether students in your classroom are members of that community, which they very well might be, or whether it's a community in another country. But the idea of highlighting not just what can our community do to help other people, these poor other people in other countries or in other communities, but how can we how can we become more familiar with what communities are doing, what kinds of grassroots activism exist, what autonomy, what agency do members of other communities have to address their own what they identify as issues, right? How do other communities identify when there are needs in their communities? And so trying to make sure that it's not a savior thing of studying the problems in other cultures and studying child labor as a problem with somebody. What are other activist groups doing in other countries um, to help address injustice? That's something that I also do want to just mention because that is something that sometimes comes up a bit. Um, so I am going to revisit the goals. So, talking about hopefully we've met these goals, identifying and defining key components of social justice education. If you came into this wondering, what exactly is social justice education? Is it everything and nothing? I think sometimes that sort of you get that feeling about it. But then also relating it to New York State guidelines and then also the learning standards for language education and seeing where some of those connections are and where they may not be. Um, and then relating current research on gender just and racially just pedagogy with social justice education. Hopefully, we got a good connection there. And then finally, identifying points of entry, whether or not you were able to identify many points of entry during this short webinar, but then also looking at, where maybe looking in the future, where might social justice education and related topics be integrated in the future? One thing we always talk about is, don't think I need to overhaul everything, right? When I was a middle school French teacher, I taught 5 different levels, um, and so I taught students. I had so many things to prepare and photocopy and get ready every single day. Like the idea of overhauling any curriculum was overwhelming. But you can make small changes, So thinking about some of these things we've talked about today, what are some of these ideas that were generated in the chat? How can you bring in some of those? How can you where is that sort of talking about the low hanging fruit, right? What is the thing that would be the easiest to change? Could you bring in more and representation is important. It isn't everything. It is level one, as my colleague LJ Randolph would say, sort of level one of teaching for social justice is just making sure representation is there. But get to that level. Do you show students pictures of trans activists? Are there examples of people with non-binary individuals? Are there examples of them just as an example of a person in a class? Are there examples of people who are gay that you provide gay families in your class? How can you make sure that those are there? That's one thing you can do. That's sort of a low-hanging fruit, level one. And then thinking about what are some other things that you can add to that. And so that is where I'm going to stop for now. I'm going to give some time for questions.